Hello everyone. Thanks for viewing this video today. I have the great honour of talking with Peter Schaeken, who is the peer work coordinator at New Horizons, but was the very first community peer worker in Australia. So we're really honoured to have Pete with us today. But before we start talking with Pete, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands that we live, work, and play on, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And we also acknowledge that this land was never ceded. And I'd like to pay our respects to those of us with lived experience, Pete and I, and everyone joining us today watching this video, and also for everyone who cares about people with lived experience. And we know that's you, because otherwise you wouldn't be watching this video. So thank you very much. So Pete, thank you so much for coming and talking with us today.
Thank you very much, Faye, and thank you for your introduction.
Pete, I was wondering, could you give us your history, how you got started in peer work? What happened before you became a peer worker?
Yeah, part of it's to do with my journey, which began at about 1983. I was first put on medication after being told I might have schizophrenia. And then in 1984, I had my first episode, um, and I was in the hospital for 9 months.
Mm.
In 1986, I had another admission, and I was in the hospital for 3 months. These admissions to hospital led me to conclude that professionals didn't know enough about schizophrenia
Mm.
and that I wanted to do something to improve the lives of people with schizophrenia who were clients of the mental health system. So I came up with the idea to do some research, and the foundations for the survey on schizophrenia, or SOS project, were laid. And I contacted the Schizophrenia Fellowship and told them what I wanted to do. And they assisted me in getting a committee of mental health consumers to work on this exciting project. And we also got a university student as well, to help us with the admin side of things. With the SOS project, we got funding got two grants for pilot study, and we developed 170 primarily multiple choice questions. And the aim was to survey 1,000 people. And then we had, for professional oversight, um, Alan Rosen and Chris Tennant. Alan told me about this new group that just started, New South Wales Consumer Advisory Group, and suggested I go to a meeting to try and get people to help with my survey. I went to my meeting in 1993, and they asked me to join the group. So I was very honoured to be asked to join the New South Wales Consumer Advisory Group, because around the table were about 15 consumers and carers who also felt like me that the mental health system needed changes. And I became president of Westworks, a non-government organisation in the Nepean area. I held various board positions with the New South Wales Consumer Advisory Group. And then in late 1994, um, two people from the Consumer Advisory Group contacted me and told me about this job going for a community consumer consultant coordinator role at Roselle Hospital. I applied for it in 1994, and I was successful in getting this job. And this was the first community peer work job in Australia. Even though I was located in the hospital to begin with, it was community, because we employed 6 consumer consultants, and they worked in the various community health centres of the Central Sydney Area Health Service area.
Oh.
Um,
You
and
were
that,
you the manager of them, Pete?
yeah, I was the coordinator, and
Right, right,
and so,
okay.
and so we employed 6 people, some who are still working mental health today. The funding was available only for 12 months,
Mm.
and then the peer workers or community consumer consultants were employed for a total of 6 months, and then we had to do evaluations and write a report, which myself and Elizabeth Barry from Central Sydney Health Service helped write. They they weren't continued as peer workers, and then what happened in 1996, the full-time position of area coordinator of consumer initiatives was advertised, and I applied for that job and was successful in that. And that was the first full-time peer work job in Australia
Right,
at
right.
the time. And so I was very honoured to get that job, and I was the only peer worker in the community, but there were other peer workers who started in 1993, including Helen Bloom, the coordinator, who worked at Rosedale Hospital, and she had 6 people employed for 3 hours a week, but they were employed by the hospital, and I
Mm,
was employed by the community. So there were two distinct budgets,
mhm.
and it wasn't till about 2000 that we got funding to employ more community consumer consultants and they were made permanent.
Pete, peer work or consumer consultants, as they were called, as you were called back then. I was called a consumer consultant when I started in, I think, about 2000 as well. But we were peer workers, weren't we? Uh,
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we were also sitting on committees and one thing to try and guide the services. But Pete, what was it like in those early days? Were
In
you
the
welcomed in? Was it challenging?
in the early days, I was located at the Marrickville Community Health Centre, and that was a very good health centre, some very good work because there was a very mature workforce, and they demonstrated time and time again positive attitudes towards myself and consumers. So that was very good. But in the early days, I was in this building by myself, so it was very isolating as well. I was wanting to get a backup for myself. I thought that was very important because I was on something like 35 committees at one stage, and that was far too many committees to be effective because I didn't have time to talk to consumers.
Mm,
But the Central Sydney Health Service had a lot of consumer reps.
mm,
So in the early days, I would set up meetings with the reps. We also ran a number of consumer forums twice a year in the early days as well. And sometimes we get as many as 30, 35 people coming to these consumer forums. Only consumers could come, but we invited the staff who were consumers to come to the meetings as well. And I did have some inquiries from some staff about the forums, but it was rare that a staff member would come to a consumer forum. And around 1995 was still about the first National Mental Health Strategy, and then it went on to the second National Mental Health Strategy exam as well. And so there were a lot of consultations in the early days, national consultations, which I would go to. And eventually, once I got a computer and everything, we had to share computers to begin with. Once I got on the internet, I developed a mailing list, and then eventually, when we had the peer workers, we had them made permanent as well, and we had their hours increased. So there was 4 of us in the community, and the hospital consultants were still going.
So there weren't any peer workers working in the hospital.
There were some, but as they left, they weren't replaced.
Oh, I see. How was it, Pete, in those early days? Were they welcoming of peer workers or?
I can remember sometimes it was almost hostile with some people, but I mainly dealt with community health centres and staff working there. Um, but if I said something that was seen as controversial, they were quick to react.
Right. So Pete, you were trailblazing, weren't you? So I guess you were sort of in some ways working it out as you go. What were some of the achievements back then?
Yeah, in the initial stages, Faye, I concentrated on the big picture rather than individual advocacy. I thought the big picture was the way to go, as peer work was such a new profession in mental health. So I would attend consultations by NCAG, the National Community Advisory Group, or SPICE Consulting with evaluation of the National Mental Health Strategy, um, or consultation on national mental health standards for consumers, which were adopted. I think that was about 96. We worked closely with the Education Centre at Rosedale Hospital and they were very good. And they always made sure consumers spoke in their courses. So often I would speak at the suicide awareness prevention course. Some other consumer reps that we had were speakers at various courses. I need to mention, I give a real plug to Phil Escott, the peer worker who recently retired. He was very instrumental in those early days as well. He started uh, working with Helen Bloom to begin with, and then he switched over to community consumer coordinator. Um, and he did a lot of good work at the Murray Bashir Centre, which is previously the Misselton unit. Um, and the community as well, and the mobile service Trenton, he worked there. Other achievements that peer workers had, I believe we changed the culture towards consumer participation with the staff, and that wasn't an easy thing to achieve. That was done over a number of years through attending staff meetings, getting referrals from staff to provide peer support to people. Um, and So we changed the culture. We educated the staff about what it was like to be suicidal. We educated the staff what it was like to live with a mental illness. We talked about stigma. Um, we we did quality activity projects as well from time to time.
But what could you give an example of that, Pete?
There was one project I was involved with a health worker called Liz Deacon. We did focus groups with different groups of consumers on access and rights, and we had a number of recommendations arising from that project. And then we presented at a conference. There was a nurses forum held at Rosehill Hospital. Liz Deacon and myself speaking at the winter symposium about our access and rights project, and we won the Ray Brown Award for that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
Do you mean the whole thing, or your presentation won the award?
just the presentation.
Right, right. That was pretty trailblazing in itself, Pete, that you're presenting with a clinical staff person as well.
Yeah, and in the early days as well, we did a lot of presentations at the themes conference, the Mental Health Services Conference of Australia and New Zealand. I remember going to Melbourne, speaking about peer work. It might have been as early as 96, 97. We spoke about peer work at that conference. Um, we also we went to a lot of the themes conferences. It's a really good way to network with other people across Australia and New Zealand. Met Mary O'Hagan at one of these conferences, who's a very famous New Zealand peer worker. We made a lot of friends along the way as well.
Mm. Pete, can I ask you, what do you think the value of lived experience is in mental health services? Is it just the one-on-one peer support, or is it more than that?
The value of lived experience should be seen as a holistic approach encompassing reform of mental health services, giving a voice to consumers of mental health services, um, health promotion in attending forums and conferences, um, doing talks to educate staff about mental illness and recovery, as well as one-on-one peer support and groups.
Right, right. So you're sort of approaching it from not just a service delivery, but also a service transformation kind of approach, trying to
Yeah. Now,
improve.
not well, not all peer workers can do that initially, but for those with 10 years or more experience,
Mm,
um, they they should be involved in things such as advocacy and attending meetings.
yeah, I agree. I think that if we get our voices into that decision-making meetings, then that's when we can have some real influence, I think.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think for the public health system, when they changed the role, the terminology from consumer consultant to consumer worker and then peer support worker, in some instances, there was a loss of focus.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I was employed as a consumer consultant, which included one-on-one support. I remember, Pete, although some of those meetings were only every 6 months, so which is a bit of a tick box thing, I think. But I remember I actually added up 128 meetings that I'd been involved in over sort of a 4-year period. It was full on work, wasn't it? Trying to
Yeah.
bring a new voice. I found it really
Mm,
difficult. We were kind of working it out as we went, weren't we? And I think
mm.
that it was difficult for the staff to understand really what we were there for, what we were there to do.
Correct,
Mm,
correct.
mm.
Um, and one of the great things to talk about these days is the advent of the certificate for mental health peer work. It's a really good course, which many peer workers have done this course, and it greatly helps them in their peer support role.
What training was available to you in the early days, either available to you or available to your staff in the early
Yeah,
days?
that's a very good question, Faye. And in the early days, we had no certificate for mental health peer work or intentional peer support available in Australia. And so it was left to the coordinators or managers to organise training for their own peer workforce. And so some of the things we would do, I would organise training on groups or advocacy. We get a health worker to talk about debriefing, or supervision. We didn't talk about peer supervision in those days. It wasn't known about in the early days. So
Right.
it was a mishmash of training, but we tried to be. We didn't have anybody who could speak about peer support because it was so new.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that might be one of those forums or something that I might have met you at, Pete. And I remember you asked me to come and speak with the staff, and we all tried to connect with each other, didn't we? To support each
Yeah.
other and get some kind of an idea of what we were all doing together and what we thought we should be doing.
And by 1998, Sandy Watson was employed. She came up with the idea for the Consumer Workers Forum, a forum once or twice a year to be held for all the consumer consultants across New South Wales. And I can remember we'd had 30 people to ask to invite to our forums,
Yeah, 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 that's right.
and we provide some training in that for people.
Yeah, that's right. I remember sort of, meeting each person, like you say, there are only 30 of us, but it was like we were working it all out together, what needed to be done, how the best way to go about it. So Pete, you've been working as a lived experience advocate, activist, peer worker, consumer consultant, all of our different titles for nearly 30 years. What changes have you seen over those years?
Yeah, better acceptance of peer workers.
Mhm.
Um, And so I can recall going to a meeting in Greater Murray in the early days, and I was told that 10 years earlier I would have been seen as the enemy. So that was eye opening to witness that in a service that had no peer workers.
Right.
I went down there to help them out. Yeah,
Right.
so that's one change. There's greater acceptance of peer workers. There's more better understanding of the role of what peer workers are about. There's a better understanding in the city areas of what recovery is, for recovery from mental illness is, and that is a journey. It's not a destination, right? But we still got a long way to go. We still need more peer workers to change the culture for the better, make it truly recovery orientated and trauma informed services. Um, and that's been happening to a great degree, and you yourself, Faye, has played a great role in that, where you've overseen the growth of the peer workforce to over 200 peer workers in your organisation. So that's a great achievement, Faye.
Thanks, Pete. We all knew peer work would work and that we needed greater numbers. And although I was talking, in every conference that I spoke at as a deputy commissioner or whatever, I could talk about it, we still weren't growing very much in numbers. And so I knew
No,
I needed a team to be able to work with. And I had the great honour of being appointed in Flourish as a general manager of inclusion, which is a designated lived experience role, but on the executive level. And so that gave me the opportunity to sort of really guide what we needed to do. And I instituted the Why Not a Peer Worker strategy. And that grew our peer worker numbers really quickly. And then that really influenced other services. So, Pete, you've been working with New Horizons for about 6 years now, isn't it?
That's correct, Faye.
How many peer workers do you have at New Horizons, Pete?
Yeah, when I started in 2018, Faye, there were 6 peer workers plus myself, and now we've got about 30 peer workers in our peer workforce.
And can you see that they're having a positive influence in your workforce?
I think they are, and over time we will grow the peer workforce in New Horizons
Mhm,
and be able to offer really good service to the customers of New Horizons and their carers.
mhm, mhm. New Horizons isn't just working in mental health, is it?
No, no. It covers a broad range of areas. It covers including mental health, NDIS, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs, young people's programs, disability programs, and older persons programs.
Mhm. And do the peer workers, do they only work with people that have only mental health issues, or do they work with people that have other issues as well?
At this point, because we're still early in the growth,
Mm.
they're mainly focused in mental health.
Yeah, right. Which is what I would assume.
Mm,
But obviously, people with other disabilities have more of a likelihood, really, to have mental health issues as well. So
yeah.
they can have some quite complex needs. And
Mm.
I thought, I wondered whether the peer workers were working with people in that way.
Yeah, they some peer workers in NDIS as well.
I remember Gwen telling me one day, and I've certainly saw this many, many times myself working in the psych wards, but I remember Gwen Scottman telling me one day that a person was brought by ambulance to the A&E department of the hospital that she was working in, um, and the person was quite volatile, and the staff were being volatile towards the person, and Gwen stepped in and just calmed the whole situation down. And that's I often found as a peer worker, staff were expecting me to calm down the people, but it was actually the staff I had to calm down first before I could
Yeah,
the people to
yeah.
calm down. So yeah, we tend to we're not just a positive influence on people with mental health issues. We're
Mm,
also have positive influence on the culture, on staff,
yeah.
on on policies and guidelines and all of those things. So
Yeah.
yeah. Pete, we know we've seen through like with Beyond Blue, Black Dog Institute, that there's been a lot of focus on things like depression and anxiety, but I don't see the same community awareness around diagnosis. And I don't like diagnosis, I'm not into it, but things like schizophrenia, bipolar, borderline personality disorder, that kind of thing. So do you think that that's correct, that society still doesn't really understand those
I think
experiences?
I think I think you're absolutely correct, Faye. Um, there's a lot of new mental health groups, and they're talking about yeah, depression and anxiety or suicidality. Um, yeah, but we need to see more positive stories in the media about people with schizophrenia, people with bipolar, people with borderline personality disorder. Yeah, I, I agree with you.
It really, whenever something happens that is really tragic, and it gets blamed on mental illness, what kind of an impact do you see that having on people? If it was said that the person had schizophrenia, does that impact people who have mental health issues, Pete?
The stigma can be very strong towards those people, and sometimes the worst stigma can be the self stigma. So one of the really good things happening has been the the start of the development of the anti-stigma campaign at the national level being rolled out by the Mental Health Commission.
Yeah, I do have a little problem with that though, in that I think it should
Yep.
be called the discrimination campaign, because I think we
Yep.
often call discrimination stigma. Um,
Mm,
but when stigma is acted out in some way,
mm, mm.
then it's discrimination. And I think that a lot of people get away. There's no law against stigma, but there is law against discrimination. And I
Yeah.
think people are often getting away with discrimination because
Yeah.
we use the word stigma so much. But
Mm.
yeah, I think that's something we really need to work on. Pete, can I ask you what you
Yep.
think about the suicide
Yep.
prevention?
Yep.
It seems to have been carved off a bit from mental health. There's quite a lot of work going on, over there about suicide prevention, and there's mental health services over there. That's different to how it used to be. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think it's evolved over time. There's been, because when there's a suicide in some communities, there can be a whole lot of distress for some of those specific communities, and some of those people who have been impacted have lobbied for funding and programs to assist members of the community or members of their family, um, and so I think it can be a positive thing that there are more people getting involved in mental health and wanting to make a difference and prevent suicide and promote recovery.
And so, Pete, what's your hope for the future? What do you think? If you had one wish, what would that wish be?
My wish would be to see a peer worker available for anybody in Australia who wanted a peer worker through GPs, work with the police, work with Centrelink, work in public mental health, private mental health, NGOs, um, yeah, everywhere.
And so, do you think there's a place for peer workers like working beside police and
Yeah, for
um,
sure, for sure.
well, thanks so much for your time with us today, Pete. It was really wonderful to be able to hear that history and see where it all sort of started to bloom from. So thank you for everything you've done, Pete, for our community and services. You've been a real trailblazer, and thank you so much, Pete.
Thank you very much, Faye, for asking me to participate in this interview, and I look forward to seeing the video.
Great. Thanks, Pete. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.